is that the root cause for many of the problems we face in the world today is that we have lost the balance between rights and responsibilities. And many parts of the world have lost this balance. But in my view, it is the loss of this balance in the West that matters the most, because the West, at the end of the day, still represents the strongest and most dominant civilization in global affairs. And I consistently say that we in the rest of humanity, and the rest of humanity, by the way, includes 88% of the world's population, we should all thank the West for providing many of the key drivers that explains the extraordinary progress that humanity has made in the past few decades. And one simple fact of history that so many people are unaware of is that if you look at the long arc of human history and you want to measure human progress, the last 30 years of human progress have been the best 30 years in 3,000 years of human history. And why did that happen? Is because the West shared its wisdom with the rest of the world. So given the importance of the West, if the West gets lost, we are in trouble. And the sad part here is that the West is getting lost because Western philosophers used to give equal emphasis to rights and to responsibilities. But contemporary Western thinkers have lost their way, and they only focus on rights and never speak about responsibilities. And this tendency to ignore the importance of responsibilities, as I will show, I hope, with concrete examples in my lecture, this lack of attention to responsibilities has explained why the West is in trouble. And so I hope that my lecture today will actually be helpful to the West and say, hey, why didn't you go back to what you used to do in the past, which is to emphasize the importance of both rights and responsibilities. And if you want examples, just very quickly, of how the West has failed to pay attention to responsibilities, just two simple examples. One is the West used to always say, we want to create a society with equality of opportunity. We want to take care of the rich and the poor. And I'll show you with some concrete examples how that has disappeared now. And in many ways, as I'll show, the United States has become a plutocracy. And second example, of course, if you look at our planet and you see the challenges that climate change gives us, we have lost the sense of responsibility to protect our fragile and endangered planet. So these are examples of what happens when you don't focus on responsibility. But to begin my story, I'm going to first of all talk about a specific event that I actually participated in personally in the year 1998. And this happened actually on December 1998 when the UN General Assembly met to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I want to emphasize very strongly that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a very important document through both the letter and spirit of this document, which we should all read carefully. We eradicated many practices which have deprived many, if not most, human beings of basic human rights, practices like slavery, feudalism, serfdom, unequal treatment of women, child labor, and so on. A lot of this was eradicated by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 was a huge leap forward in human history. But in 1998, 50 years later, when we began to discuss the document, a group of leading statesmen in the world, led by the legendary former German chancellor. And here I'm glad that the German ambassador is here because he can attest to what a great man Helmut Schmidt was. I mean, he was genuinely a great man, Helmut Schmidt. The German chancellor, suggested the adoption of a universal declaration of human responsibilities. We have a universal declaration of human rights. Let's have a universal declaration of human responsibilities. And that in fact, he went further than that. He actually drafted the document, and it was then endorsed by many leading global statesmen, including Malcolm Fraser of Australia, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, Pierre Trudeau of Canada, and Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union and Russia. Now, Helmut Schmidt drafted his declaration in 1997. Therefore, the perfect opportunity to have launched this Universal Declaration of Human Responsibilities would be in 1998. And in fact, I think he had it in mind when he drafted it in 1997. Let's discuss it when we discuss the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as we know, the West believes in the virtues of free speech, believes in open debates. And so I thought, hey, the Western governments would be so happy that they would table Helmut Schmidt's draft declaration, and we could have a great discussion among all the 193 countries in the world to see whether or not we should adopt this Universal Declaration of Human Responsibilities. That would have been what should have happened. But I can tell you, because I was there personally, and I watched in my own eyes what happened, I was genuinely shocked when it was the Western governments which mounted a very powerful campaign to ensure that Schmidt's declaration would not see the light of day and would not be discussed or mentioned. There was total suppression of that document. And I believe that that event, when the West suppressed the discussion of the Universal Declaration of Human Responsibilities, was a key mistake that the West made, and also subsequently led to many of the other mistakes that were made. And the question, of course, is why did the West do that? Why did the West suppress this document? Well, the answer is complicated, but it reflected the zeitgeist of the 1990s. And in the 1990s, as you know, the zeitgeist came from Francis Fukuyama's famous essay, The End of History. And for those of you who know the essay, he said he predicted that humanity had reached the end of history, and the whole world could reach nirvana just by copying Western liberal democratic societies. Now, as we know, that was an incredibly naive thesis, but that was a thesis that everyone embraced at that time. And at the same time, the embrace of that thesis also reflected a worldview that basically said the West had won the Cold War because it supported human rights, and the Soviet Union lost because it suppressed human rights. And this statement is true. But it was equally important that Western societies were also more just societies where the working classes and middle classes also progressed in addition to the upper classes. There was a level playing field among all classes. The rich could progress, the poor could progress, although I have to add as a caveat, in the US, the Blacks, Native Americans, some women, and other minorities often had to wage struggles for the right to have these rights. But still, there's no doubt in the 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe even 80s, all of American society used to progress. But then, in the past 30 years, something dramatically changed. And that dramatic change was that the bottom 50% in the United States saw their average income stagnate and not improve for 30 years. Now, why that happened again is a very complicated story. As James alluded to it, I actually devoted an entire chapter 7 of my book, Has China Won, to discuss how America became plutocracy. And what I'm going to give you today is a very quick, rough summary of what I say in the book. And I argue that the reason why the US deviated from its traditional responsibility of creating a level playing field between the rich and the poor is that it deviated from the traditional Western philosophical emphasis on freedom and equality. I'm going to use the words freedom and equality very often because the traditional Western philosophers, if you read them, always put them in the same breath: freedom, equality. I'll give you an example. The great Genevan philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau said in his famous work, The Social Contract, and I quote, "If one inquires into precisely what the greatest good of all consists in, which ought to be the end of every system of legislation, one will find that it comes down to these two principal objects, freedom and equality. Freedom, because any individual independence is that much force taken away from that state. Equality, because freedom cannot subsist without it," unquote. And to quote a more recent British philosopher, Harold Lasky, whom I think our founding fathers, Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee, actually knew, he said, quote, "There is no effective freedom in a society if there are wide differences between citizens in their access